Hello, my dear friends. Just one waltz repetition was enough to make the bride's family want to cancel the engagement. In Victorian times, love was not spoken, emotions were not expressed, and every private action was monitored by servants, future mothers-in-law, or menstrual cycles. Every gift, every smile, even the smell of perfume, could become an excuse to be banned forever. There was no room for spontaneity, only formulas and acting. Tonight, let's quietly step into the strange world of Victorian dating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone today imagines Victorian dating as a private chance for two people to discover one another, the reality was entirely different. A meeting between a young man and woman of respectable class was less about romance and far more about demonstration. It was an event set up to prove that each side was suitable, not only for one another, but for the families standing behind them. In this sense, every encounter resembled an inspection. The household created the stage, the participants acted out the expected roles, and the judgment was passed quietly once the visitor left. The result was rarely based on affection. It was based on how well each candidate performed under the silent but heavy weight of social expectation. The setting was almost always domestic, a parlour arranged with polished furniture, carefully placed flowers, and a tray of tea served as the environment where these rituals unfolded. The young woman appeared dressed with purpose. Her gown was selected not by whim but by calculation. A colour too bold might look improper, while a colour too plain might seem careless. Even the way she moved into the room carried meaning. She did not walk to greet the visitor for her comfort. She walked in a way that showed her training, her discipline, and her readiness to be measured. The young man entered with similar awareness. His clothing, his gloves, his bow, and his first words were studied. Families looked for signs of arrogance, signs of poverty, or signs of frivolity. A misplaced comment or a clumsy action could easily close the door to another meeting. For him, impressing the young woman was only part of the task. More important was convincing her family that he was respectable, stable, and morally reliable. Privacy was absent. The concept of two people spending time together without oversight was considered improper. A mother or an aunt often sat nearby, pretending to pour tea while in reality observing every movement. Even siblings sometimes joined to ensure that nothing occurred beyond the approved script. In this atmosphere, natural conversation was nearly impossible. Words were filtered, glances were restrained, and emotions were buried. It almost feels like calling these encounters dates is a joke, since they had more in common with examinations at school than with moments of affection. The pressure on young women was immense. They were taught that their reputation rested on these occasions. A laugh too loud, a smile too long, or a look too direct could damage their standing. Families wanted their daughters to appear modest, gentle, and controlled. This meant that authenticity was dangerous. To be too much herself was to risk being judged as reckless. A girl might feel excitement or boredom, but she could not show either. Instead, she performed composure as though it were a second skin. Young men felt pressure of another kind. They had to present themselves as serious and prepared for marriage. Flirtation without purpose was seen as a waste of time. They were measured not only by manners but by financial stability and family reputation. A charming personality was never enough. If his income was insufficient or his background questionable, the match would likely fail. When we compare this to today, where a bad first date often just means moving on to another, in the Victorian world, a single poor impression could shape the rest of a person's marriage prospects. After the visit ended, the real work of judgment began. Families gathered quietly. A mother might comment on how the visitor held his teacup. A father might remark on how a girl's voice carried too much eagerness. Every detail was taken as evidence of character. These evaluations were not spoken in front of the young people, but they determined whether the relationship advanced or ended. What seems minor to us was decisive to them. The entire process stripped away the idea of personal choice. For young women, the expectation was to demonstrate obedience to tradition. For young men, the expectation was to show reliability for the future. Feelings of love, if they existed, were considered secondary. This is why novels of the period were filled with longing and passion. In real life, those qualities had little safe place to exist. The parlour was no home for desire, it was a room for control. Even the smallest gestures carried coded meaning. A pause before answering a question could suggest hesitation. Too much eagerness to please could be read as desperation. To succeed, one had to maintain a delicate balance that few could master with ease. I cannot help but think how exhausting it must have been to live each day knowing that even the simplest smile could be misread as a flaw. The constant presence of supervision meant that nothing escaped the eyes of others. Servants often became silent observers, reporting what they noticed to their employers. Family friends repeated impressions during afternoon teas. A young couple could not escape these networks of judgment. Their personal story never truly belonged to them. It was always filtered through layers of family opinion. The weight of these encounters was clear. Marriage in Victorian times was rarely the product of passion. It was the result of successful navigation through a maze of social rules. Those who failed to meet the standards faced difficulties in securing any match at all. A reputation damaged once was difficult to repair. Families remembered, neighbours whispered, and opportunities closed. To step into a drawing room was to step into a test. The teacups, the chairs, and the polished floors were not just decorations. They were instruments in a system designed to measure morality and suitability. Both sides knew this, and both sides behaved accordingly. The young man showed respect. The young woman performed modestly. Their families looked on and decided it was not love, but it was the accepted path to marriage. This system of judgment defined the rhythm of courtship for decades. Those who lived within it accepted its rules, just as people today accept the rules of their social environments. They did not question whether there could be another way. To them, it seemed natural. But behind the politeness and refinement lay an unspoken truth. These meetings were not about two people. They were about families seeking assurance that their honour and status would remain intact. Behind these gatherings, there was always someone watching in silence, keeping her thoughts hidden. The mother of the household held the real key, and her sudden judgment could change the entire future of the relationship. Underneath the watchful rituals of Victorian meetings, another layer of power always remained. The quiet presence of the mother was far more decisive than anything spoken between the young man and woman. She might sit calmly, appearing to serve tea or smile politely, but she was measuring every detail. Families relied on her judgment because she was believed to know how to read people best. The mother observed posture, tone of voice, and small expressions that others might ignore. In her hands rested the approval or rejection that shaped whether a connection could continue. The young couple, often nervous enough with the formalities, also carried the silent knowledge that the mother's impression could determine their future. Her authority was rooted in tradition. Fathers held legal and financial control, but mothers managed reputation and morality within the household. A daughter might be close to her father, but the final say on courtship often came from her mother's opinion. Likewise, a suitor could impress with wealth or good name, but if the mother disliked his manners, it would be difficult to move forward. This was not openly declared, yet everyone understood it. The control was subtle, but unshakable. It is almost funny that a young man could prepare for weeks to present himself well, only to be dismissed because he stirred his tea the wrong way in front of his mother. The influence of mothers stretched beyond the moment of the visit. Conversations held later in drawing rooms or over afternoon tea often centred on the impressions gathered from these encounters. Sisters, aunts, and family friends might offer their views, but it was the mother's voice that carried the most weight. Her approval acted as a green light, while her disapproval often meant an end without discussion. Daughters were expected to follow her guidance, and sons rarely went against it either. It was assumed that mothers saw what others could not, and to question her judgment risked dishonouring the family. This authority created an atmosphere of constant testing. A young woman meeting her potential future family knew that the mother of her suitor would be studying her carefully. A misstep could brand her as unsuitable, a laugh at the wrong moment, an expression of confidence that seemed too bold, or even the choice of a dress could lead to criticism. The mother did not need to confront her directly. A quiet remark later, a look exchanged with her husband, or a subtle comment during tea could be enough to close the matter. For the young woman, the risk of rejection was ever present. Modern readers may find it strange that a person's entire future could rest on such delicate observations. Compared to today, where couples often decide together whether they like each other, in the Victorian world, a third party made the crucial choice, and that third party was usually the mother. This placed enormous pressure on young women to master social codes. They rehearsed their smiles, controlled their laughter, and trained themselves in every form of politeness. What might seem natural to us was carefully drilled into them, because they knew how much depended on these performances. The mothers themselves did not always act with cruelty. Many believed they were protecting their children from unsuitable matches. They saw it as their duty to safeguard the family's reputation and stability. In a society where scandal could destroy prospects, their caution made sense to them. Still, their judgments could feel harsh. They might dismiss a girl for appearing too eager or for seeming too independent. Sometimes these opinions were based on prejudice rather than fact. But in that world, her perspective was decisive. From the suitor's side, the challenge was no less daunting. A young man trying to win favour had to court not only the woman he admired but also her mother. This meant he had to balance charm with restraint, to show respect without appearing weak. He needed to signal seriousness while avoiding arrogance. The mother's evaluation was constant, and any failure to meet her standards could cancel his efforts. I think this must have been deeply frustrating for many young people, knowing that their feelings counted for less than the impressions recorded silently by an older observer. Reports about these encounters did not vanish quickly. Families kept long memories. A single mistake could resurface later in conversations, shaping future decisions. When mothers gathered with friends for tea, they often shared impressions of potential suitors or brides. These networks spread information across households, sometimes magnifying small errors into lasting reputations. In this way, the influence of one mother could ripple outward, affecting the chances of many young people in the community. For young women hoping to marry well, impressing the mother-in-law became a goal as important as securing the interest of the man himself. They studied manners, practiced small gestures, and tried to anticipate expectations. For young men, winning the respect of the mothers was a way to prove maturity and readiness. These dynamics made the mother a gatekeeper to marriage. Even if she rarely spoke openly about her power, she was the silent judge, shaping outcomes with a nod or a frown. The result of this system was that romantic relationships were often interrupted before they could develop. A couple might feel drawn to one another, but if the mother disapproved, the connection ended swiftly. There was little space for rebellion. Families placed stability above affection, and young people were expected to comply. Those who resisted risked scandal and exclusion. The control of mothers ensured that boundaries were enforced. This dominance also reflected the wider role of women in Victorian households. While men managed property and politics, women governed morality and domestic reputation. The drawing room was their domain, and within it they exercised authority with precision. Courtship, being both moral and domestic, fell naturally into their hands. What outsiders might see as quiet influence was, in reality, a powerful control over the direction of family life. As we look back, the image of Victorian mothers becomes clear. They were not simply background figures. They were the central arbiters of who was allowed to marry into the family and who was cast aside. Their approval was not a formality. It was the deciding factor. This authority shaped countless lives, determining futures in ways that modern people might struggle to understand. And as these mothers tightened their hold on courtship, another layer of surveillance was at work too, carried out by people who seemed invisible but who could quietly destroy an entire romance. In the flow of Victorian courtship, once the mother's quiet judgment set the tone, the next stage often came through something far less personal, a small piece of paper, carefully printed and often carried in the pocket of every respectable gentleman, became the main tool for opening doors to potential relationships. This was the calling card, and in the rigid system of the time, it was far more than a polite introduction. A card left at the door was not simply a way of saying hello, it was a request to be considered, a signal of intent, and an invitation for a family to evaluate whether the man was even worth a conversation. To modern eyes, it may seem cold to treat courtship like an exchange of business cards, but for Victorians, it fit perfectly into their structured world. The calling card was simple in form but heavy in meaning. It usually displayed only a man's name and sometimes his title or address. Yet when he left it at the door of a household, he was not just offering his identity, he was asking for permission. The family of the young woman now held the power to accept or reject without ever having to confront him directly. If they were interested, they might return the gesture with a card of their own or allow him to visit. If not, they simply did nothing. Silence was enough. For the man, waiting for a reply could feel like waiting for a verdict. It is almost sarcastic to note that men called this romance, while in reality, it was more like a job application where rejection came without even a thank you letter. The silence itself carried weight. A family did not need to explain why they ignored a card. Perhaps they found the man's reputation questionable. Perhaps his income seemed insufficient. Perhaps the mother simply disliked him. Whatever the reason, he received no explanation. His card would remain unanswered, and the door would stay closed. This method avoided conflict but also stripped away any sense of mutual choice. The decision belonged firmly to the household, not the individual young woman. For young women, receiving cards was both flattering and burdensome. Some were known to collect many, sometimes dozens, in the span of a season. Each card represented a possible future, but also an obligation to respond or reject through family channels. She rarely had the freedom to answer according to her feelings. Instead, she listened to the advice of her parents, especially her mother. A card from a wealthy man with a strong reputation was taken seriously, even if she felt little personal interest. Meanwhile, a card from someone she might secretly admire could be dismissed if her family judged him unworthy. This created a peculiar imbalance. The outward appearance of courtship seemed polite and controlled, yet inside the homes, it was full of quiet negotiations and unspoken rules. For many men, the card became the only safe way to approach a woman without scandal. To speak directly was improper. To write a letter without permission risked offence. The card was neutral, formal, and acceptable. But it also drained the process of intimacy. A man's first move toward romance was reduced to placing a piece of paper on a silver tray, when compared to today, where someone might send dozens of quick messages online in minutes. The Victorian ritual of delivering a single card and waiting days or weeks for a response feels astonishingly slow and restrained. The cards themselves carried layers of social meaning. Quality of paper, style of printing, and even the manner of delivery were all noted. A poorly designed card suggested carelessness or a lack of refinement. A card delivered at the wrong time of day showed ignorance of etiquette. Some families judged a man's worth before even meeting him, simply by looking at the quality of his card. This added yet another layer of performance to an already exhausting system. Men spent effort and money ensuring that their cards communicated dignity and seriousness. In some cases, households kept the cards they received as records. Trays filled with names displayed the level of attention a daughter attracted. Visitors could glance at them and silently measure her desirability. For the young woman herself, this was a double-edged sword. A full tray meant she was admired, but it also meant she was constantly under comparison. Her popularity became a matter of family pride, but not necessarily personal joy. The practice also created social hierarchies. A man of high standing expected his card to be answered promptly. A man of lower status often knew his card would be ignored. Families treated cards from prestigious households with more respect than those from newcomers. In this way, the system reinforced class boundaries. Courtship did not open doors between groups. It tightened the locks. Some young women quietly mocked the process. They saw the pile of cards as evidence of how little their real feelings mattered, but mocking it openly was dangerous. Families expected them to treat every card as serious business. Many of these young women must have grown tired of smiling politely at stacks of names, knowing that their voices were the least important part of the decision. Even when a card was accepted, the process moved slowly. The man might be invited to call at a set time, under supervision. This did not guarantee progress. It only allowed him to demonstrate himself further. Families used the card system as a filter, ensuring that only those who passed the first test ever reached the drawing room. From there, mothers and fathers continued to judge. The calling card was not romance. It was the gate through which all romance had to pass. The irony of this custom lies in its lack of personal connection. What began as a polite social tool became the central method of courtship. Men and women who might have shared a genuine interest were forced to navigate this ritual, turning affection into bureaucracy. The card symbolized approval and rejection at once. For some, it opened doors. For others, it marked the end before anything began. Looking back, the calling card system reflects how much Victorian dating resembled a performance rather than a personal journey. Every step was coded, every gesture monitored, and every decision filtered through family authority. The young people themselves played only small roles in their own stories. Their futures depended not on feelings, but on cards, reputations, and judgments they could not control. And while families used these small pieces of paper to control access, there were other figures in the household who watched quietly, carrying tales and shaping outcomes in ways the young couple could never predict. Life inside a Victorian household did not revolve around family members. Within those same walls lived the servants, and their presence shaped courtship in ways that were often invisible but deeply powerful. They were the ones who opened doors, carried letters, and moved quietly through parlours and corridors. Their duties gave them constant access to private moments. A suitor arriving with flowers or a carefully written note did not simply meet the young woman of the house. He first passed through the eyes and ears of those employed there. Servants noticed everything. They saw how long a man lingered at the door, how nervous a young woman seemed after a visit, and how the family reacted once the guest had gone. They rarely spoke openly, but their quiet observations often travelled back to the masters in subtle ways. A glance that lingered too long, a smile held for a second more than proper, or a sudden blush could all be recorded in the mind of a servant. Later, these impressions might be whispered in the kitchen or mentioned lightly to a mistress during conversation. Families trusted their staff to report on the behaviour of guests, and this trust turned servants into silent judges of propriety. A young couple might believe they were discreet, but nothing escaped the attention of those who moved constantly through the house. It is almost amusing that the same people asked to polish the silver were also expected to polish the reputations of their employers by reporting on every slip in behaviour. Letters were perhaps the most vulnerable part of this surveillance system. Romantic correspondence had to pass through multiple hands before reaching its intended recipient. A servant often collected the post, and another delivered it upstairs. Along the way, envelopes could be opened or at least examined. Content judged too emotional or daring could be criticised before it ever reached the addressee. Sometimes letters never arrived at all. They were intercepted quietly. either to prevent scandal or to assert control. For the young people writing them, every word carried the risk of exposure. This constant inspection extended beyond the walls of the house. When young couples walked in gardens or attended social events, servants still watched. A maid accompanying her mistress, or a footman standing by a carriage, noticed every movement. Their reports later shaped family impressions. In some households, servants became trusted informants who effectively controlled whether a courtship was seen as respectable or improper. Their role was not to support romance, but to guard the family name. Modern dating relies heavily on privacy, even secrecy at times, but Victorian couples had none of this. Compared to today, where people text in private or meet without oversight, Victorians lived under a constant shadow of observation, and that shadow often came from the very staff serving the meals. The irony is that families both relied on and feared their servants. They needed their loyalty, but they also knew how much power they carried through knowledge. A disloyal servant could ruin reputations by sharing information beyond the household. Young women understood this reality clearly. They knew that every smile, every hurried note, and every small gesture might be carried back to their mothers through the words of a maid. This made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. Even if a girl wanted to show interest, she had to weigh the consequences of what the servants might say. Families expected daughters to behave modestly, and the presence of watchful staff ensured that this expectation was enforced. For the young men, the challenge was equally heavy. A clumsy remark could be repeated, and an emotional letter could be criticized before reaching its destination. The servants themselves lived in an unusual position. They were close enough to see the private emotions of their employers, yet distant enough to be treated as invisible. They passed through rooms without acknowledgement, yet their observations carried weight. Their lives were tied to the households they served, and loyalty was expected. Still, they could not escape the temptation of gossip. Sharing information, even small details, gave them influence. In a world where class barriers were so strong, information became their subtle power. From the family's perspective, this system provided security. They believed that their household staff acted as protectors of morality. By monitoring behavior, they kept daughters from scandal and ensured that suitors behaved with restraint. This sense of control comforted parents, especially mothers who feared their children might stray beyond acceptable limits. Yet this same control also suffocated genuine connection. Young people were forced to hide feelings, and even simple kindness could be twisted into gossip. It is not hard to imagine how stressful this must have been. A girl might write a letter with trembling hands, unsure whether it would be read by someone other than the man she loved. A young man might hesitate before slipping a note into an envelope, aware that his words could be judged by strangers before they reached their destination. I think this made courtship feel more like a trial than a personal choice, because every step was monitored and measured by people who were not even part of the relationship. Over time, this system of surveillance became part of the normal rhythm of life. Families expected it, and servants performed it as part of their duties. Rarely did anyone question whether it was fair to the young people themselves. Privacy was not a value Victorians held in the same way we do today. Reputation mattered more, and maintaining it justified the intrusion. For families, the price of safety was worth more than the risk of giving couples freedom. This ever-present watch shaped not only relationships, but also the very idea of love. To love in Victorian society was to love under observation. Intimacy was always filtered, always restrained, always subject to outside approval. What might have grown naturally was trimmed and shaped until it fit within the acceptable boundaries. Families depended on this system, and servants became indispensable tools for maintaining it. And as these hidden observers carried whispers from parlours to kitchens, another stage awaited where romance took on a more public form, dressed in music and movement, yet still bound tightly by rules. Even after the watchful eyes of mothers and the silent reports of servants, courtship in the Victorian world still had another stage of display. That stage was the ballroom, where music and movement turned into a carefully regulated form of social evaluation. Dances were not merely entertainment, they were ceremonies, where the pairing of partners carried meaning, and the length of each dance signalled intentions that everyone in the room could read. A ball might appear to be filled with joy, chandeliers glittering above and gowns sweeping across polished floors, yet beneath the sparkle was a rigid system of judgment. Each dance offered not freedom, but another test of suitability for marriage. The waltz became one of the most controversial dances of the time. It required closeness between partners, with hands held and bodies turned toward one another in a way earlier dances had avoided. This intimacy caused alarm among older generations, but it also made the waltz a powerful signal. To dance one waltz with someone might be acceptable. To dance more than once in the same evening, especially consecutively, suggested deep interest or even an unofficial claim. Families noticed, friends whispered, suitors who repeated the same partner too often risked gossip, while young women who agreed too readily risked their reputations. It is almost comical to think that turning in circles for a few minutes could be taken as a declaration of love. But in the Victorian ballroom, it often was. Balls were structured with programs listing the order of dances. Gentlemen could request dances in advance, and ladies recorded their partners. This meant that even before the first note of music, a pattern of interest was already visible. A young woman whose card filled quickly was seen as desirable. One with empty spaces risked embarrassment. The very piece of paper meant to organise the evening became another measure of worth. Mothers looked over these cards, noting who asked for which dances and how often. Each request became evidence in the ongoing evaluation of courtship. The ballroom itself magnified social status. Wealthy families hosted grand events in their homes, while others attended public assemblies. In both cases, the guest list was carefully controlled. Invitations were a way of signalling inclusion, and being absent from important balls could damage a family's standing. For young men and women, attendance was essential. These were the arenas where reputations were made, matches were considered, and opportunities were won or lost. Missing a season of balls could mean missing the chance for a respectable marriage altogether. Once inside, the rules were unspoken but rigid. Partners bowed and curtsied, conversations were polite, and every movement was observed. A stumble on the floor might be laughed at quietly, but it could also become a whispered mark against someone's grace. Appearance mattered as much as behaviour. A gown too bright or too plain, a suit poorly fitted, or jewellery considered excessive all could feed gossip. Nothing escaped notice in a room filled with people who treated dancing as another form of surveillance. Modern readers may see dancing as light-hearted recreation, but in Victorian society, it carried weight far beyond the moment. Compared to today, when couples might dance casually in nightclubs or weddings without consequence, Victorians lived in a world where every step across the floor could shape their future. It was not simply about enjoying music. It was about signalling availability, interest, and respectability all at once. Young men faced their challenges. They had to balance attention between multiple partners. Favouring one too much could create rumours, while spreading themselves too thin could look insincere. They were expected to know the etiquette of each dance, to guide their partners smoothly, and to display confidence without arrogance. Success on the dance floor was not only physical but social. A skilled dancer who navigated etiquette well gained admiration. A poor dancer risked mockery and suspicion. Young women, meanwhile, experienced both opportunity and constraint. A full dance card gave them the appearance of popularity, but they still had to be careful. Accepting too many dances from the same man raised questions. Refusing too many offers could be seen as prideful. They learned to manage their cards strategically, balancing between politeness and caution. The act of writing down names became a delicate negotiation, with mothers often glancing over shoulders to monitor choices. Beyond the individual dances, The atmosphere of the ballroom encouraged subtle performances of affection. A glance exchanged during a pause, a few words spoken between turns, or a smile shared at the right moment could all hint at growing interest. But these gestures never remained private. Dozens of eyes caught them, and rumours spread quickly. Servants at the edges, family friends in corners, and rivals seated along the walls all noticed. The ballroom was a public stage, and every step on its floor was part of the play. Some young people did manage to enjoy themselves, finding ways to laugh quietly or savour moments of closeness. But even those moments were overshadowed by the awareness of being judged. I believe that many must have felt the weight of constant performance, knowing that what looked like joy on the outside was really another test in disguise. The music provided rhythm, but the real tempo was set by the expectations of society. This system also reinforced class boundaries. Not everyone could afford the clothing, the lessons, or the invitations required to participate fully in the dance culture. Those who lacked these resources were often excluded. For those who did attend, the display of wealth through attire and elegance through movement confirmed their place in the social order. Dance, far from being an escape, became a reinforcement of the very hierarchies that defined Victorian life. Evenings ended with more evaluation. Families remembered who danced with whom, who repeated partners, and who appeared too eager. These impressions carried forward into discussions about possible matches. A young man who danced too much with one woman might be considered serious about her, even if he had not intended such a message. A young woman who allows the same partner repeatedly might be judged as careless with her reputation. Nothing was innocent. Everything was interpreted. Looking back, the ballroom shows clearly how Victorian courtship transformed ordinary activities into coded rituals of selection. To dance was not only to move with the music, but to step into a system of judgment. Each waltz was a signal, each turn of the floor a declaration. While novels and films often romanticize these scenes, the reality was far more calculated. Beneath the chandeliers, people were not simply dancing, they were competing, performing, and negotiating futures. And when the music faded and the couples left the floor, another stage awaited. This time in the quiet drawing rooms where courtship looked less like joy and more like a rehearsed performance under candlelight. Behind the polished shine of the ballroom, courtship often continued in far smaller but no less controlled spaces. These were the private drawing rooms of the home, where meetings between young men and women were arranged in a setting designed less for intimacy and more for scrutiny. The atmosphere felt like a stage. Candles glowed not for romance but for display. A tea tray sat on the table, not to comfort guests but to provide one more opportunity to measure manners. Every chair was placed deliberately. Every clock was watched carefully. Guests knew from the moment they stepped into the room that their behaviour was being weighed. The parlour was not a refuge. It was a theatre of morality. The arrangement of the room mattered. Families took care in deciding who sat where. The daughter of the household often took a central place, visible but surrounded by relatives or trusted companions. The suitor might sit across from her, but never too close. The space between them was intentional, a physical reminder of restraint. To lean forward or reach out would be a violation. Around them, parents, siblings, or aunts positioned themselves in ways that created both a witness stand and an audience. The young people did not simply meet each other. They performed under observation. Every gesture became part of the performance. Pouring tea had to be done gracefully, with steady hands and polite words. Sitting too casually in a chair could suggest disrespect. A glance that lingered too long might raise suspicions. Silence risked being interpreted as dullness. Talking too much risked being seen as arrogant. What might feel like ordinary human variation became evidence in the ongoing evaluation of character. It is almost sarcastic to say that these were dates at all, since they resembled examinations in manners more than chances for people to know one another. Lighting added to the atmosphere. Candles or oil lamps created a soft glow, but this was not designed for warmth. It highlighted faces and made expressions clear to anyone watching. Shadows could not hide discomfort or hesitation. In this light, even small shifts of expression could be noticed. Families valued this exposure, believing it allowed them to read a person's true nature. For the participants, it was one more reminder that nothing they did escaped attention. Timing was also part of the ritual. Visits were scheduled with care, and the length of time spent together was monitored closely. Staying too long could be seen as presumptuous. Leaving too early might appear dismissive. The balance was delicate, and the clock in the corner was as much a participant as anyone else in the room. Departure times were expected to be respected to the minute. A young man who overstayed risked being remembered for his lack of restraint rather than his charm. Even conversation was tightly managed. Topics considered too personal were avoided. Instead, the discussion focused on safe subjects like literature, music, or current events. Yet even in this, caution ruled. Expressing an opinion too strongly might brand someone as improper. Families looked for moderation, not passion. A calm tone, polite phrasing, and deference to elders were essential. These standards reduced the possibility of a real connection, but they satisfied the need for appearances. Compared to modern dating, where conversations often aim to reveal personalities and feelings, Victorian parlour meetings were about hiding one's true self beneath layers of controlled politeness. Young women carried perhaps the greatest burden. Their families expected them to be graceful, modest, and quietly attentive. Any mistake reflected poorly on their virtue. A laugh too loud or a question too bold might be remembered as flaws. They were taught to sit with perfect posture, to answer calmly, and to never let impatience show. The visit was not theirs to enjoy, it was theirs to survive with dignity and tact. For young men, the burden was to show respect, seriousness, and reliability. A careless joke or a hint of impropriety could end the possibility of a match. This system reinforced the idea that courtship was not private but communal. Families participated actively in shaping outcomes. The drawing room visit was less about love and more about negotiation. Two households measured one another, deciding whether they could accept a future alliance. The young couple's role was small. They were expected to perform properly and leave decisions to their elders. Mishaps could be costly. A teacup spilled on a dress, a misplaced word, or a nervous silence could all be judged as signs of carelessness. Families remembered such incidents and repeated them in later conversations. What might have been forgotten in another context became a permanent mark. This heightened the anxiety of the young people, who knew that even an accident could shape their future. For many, the drawing room created a sense of suffocation, to sit surrounded by watchful eyes, speaking carefully chosen words, and leaving at the appointed time left little room for natural affection. It was not about discovery, but about discipline. A young woman who hoped to show kindness or curiosity had to restrain herself. A young man who wished to express admiration had to bury it in politeness. What emerged was a hollow interaction, judged valuable not for emotion but for control. I think these moments must have felt draining because they demanded constant performance without offering any space for honesty. The private stage of the parlour was, in reality, not private at all. Servants passed through, parents listened, and siblings observed. Even if a couple wanted to exchange a genuine look or word, they risked being seen. Nothing remained between them alone. What they carried from these meetings was not memory of connection, but awareness of scrutiny. Yet families continued to value this ritual. They saw it as protection against scandal and proof of moral integrity. A household that controlled its drawing room visits demonstrated discipline to society. A young couple that performed correctly gained approval. The ritual may have strangled affection, but it upheld reputation. For Victorians, reputation mattered more than love. This constant supervision and ritualized behavior reveal much about how the society viewed human interaction. They feared disorder and so they staged even the smallest meetings as performances of order. Love might bloom later, if at all, but propriety had to come first. The drawing room made sure of that, and while these staged visits gave the illusion of control, the secret exchange of written words still tempted many couples, offering hope for real intimacy even under the risk of discovery. After the parlour visits ended and the formality of the ballroom faded, many young Victorians still longed for some form of privacy. The only way to create that privacy, however fragile, was through the written word. Letters became the secret lifeline of many romances, passed quietly from one hand to another, slipped into envelopes, and sealed with hope. On the surface, the act of writing a letter looked harmless. In reality, it was one of the riskiest steps a young man or woman could take. The rules surrounding love letters were strict, and the consequences for breaking them could be severe. For men, the task was to write with care, balancing affection with restraint. A letter filled with too much passion could easily be judged as improper. Language that hints at physical desire or unrestrained emotion might brand the writer as reckless. On the other hand, a letter too cold or distant could signal a lack of sincerity. The balance was delicate. Many chose to write with formality, focusing on admiration, respect, and the promise of devotion rather than uncontrolled feeling. It is almost ironic that letters meant to express love often ended up sounding like official petitions, stripped of the very emotion they were meant to carry. For women, the act of receiving or sending letters was equally dangerous. A letter discovered by the wrong person could spark a scandal. Families expected their daughters to protect their reputations at all costs. Accepting a man's letter without parental approval was sometimes seen as betrayal. Writing back without permission was even worse. The smallest slip could brand a woman as improper, and that mark could follow her for years. Some families even punished daughters for hiding letters, seeing it as evidence of secrecy and disobedience. Letters rarely travelled privately. Servants often handled them, and many were read before reaching the intended recipient. A maid might open an envelope, or a mother might inspect the contents. Families believed it was their right to monitor correspondence. They wanted to ensure that nothing scandalous passed between their children and outsiders. This practice destroyed the very secrecy the letters were meant to create. Young people wrote with the constant awareness that others might read their words. They censored themselves, turning what could have been an outlet for intimacy into another exercise in restraint. Still, the temptation to write was strong. Letters allowed couples to express thoughts impossible to say in person under watchful eyes. Even with the risk, many chose to write anyway, hiding their notes in books, handing them through trusted friends, or even slipping them directly into the hands when no one was looking. The danger itself added to the intensity. Knowing that a single discovery could end everything made the words feel heavier, more urgent. But this urgency did not mean freedom. It meant fear. Modern readers might wonder why letters were treated with such suspicion. Compared to today, when text messages and emails flow constantly and privately between couples, Victorian love letters were fragile objects, always at risk of interception and always under suspicion of impropriety. This difference highlights how much society valued control over intimacy. Privacy was seen as a threat, and so even written words had to pass through barriers of supervision. Some letters that survived reveal the effort writers made to avoid scandal. They often contained long passages about morality, duty, and faithfulness, mixed with cautious expressions of admiration. Rarely did they include direct statements of desire. Instead, feelings were buried beneath layers of careful phrasing. A man might write of respect for a woman's virtues rather than his longing for her presence. A woman might express gratitude for a man's attentions rather than confessing her feelings. These strategies protected them, but they also dulled the honesty of what they wrote. The families, of course, justified their interference as protection. They argued that young people could be misled, that men might deceive daughters with false promises, or that women might become too emotional and risk their virtue. By monitoring letters, they believed they were shielding their children from harm. Yet this protection often became suffocation. Genuine affection was treated as a problem to be managed. Scandals erupted when letters were discovered in the wrong context. A single note hidden in a drawer could be read by a parent and taken as evidence of disobedience. If the correspondence was considered improper, the relationship could be ended immediately. In some cases, young women were forbidden to see certain men again, their families locking them away from further contact. For men, exposure could ruin reputations, branding them as dishonourable or untrustworthy. The risk was so great that many destroyed letters after reading them, fearing what might happen if they were found later. For those who managed to keep letters hidden, the experience could be bittersweet. On one hand, the written words allowed them to feel closer, to believe that their feelings were real and shared. On the other hand, the constant threat of exposure turned every message into a gamble. I think it must have been both thrilling and exhausting to cling to secret notes that could either bring joy or destroy reputations in an instant. Despite the dangers, letters continued to circulate. They offered the only chance for private communication in a world that allowed almost none. The handwriting itself became a form of intimacy. Holding a page that a loved one had touched, seeing the ink they had chosen, and reading words written just for them gave a sense of closeness unmatched by the formalities of parlours or ballrooms. It was a fragile closeness, always under threat, but it was better than nothing. Some couples managed to carry on long correspondence, slipping letters through trusted friends or sympathetic servants. Others failed quickly when families intercepted the first exchange. The outcome depended less on the couple's feelings and more on the network of control surrounding them. Privacy was never guaranteed. Every envelope was a risk, every word a test of caution. Looking back, love letters reveal both the desire for intimacy and the heavy restraints of Victorian society. They show how young people tried to carve out spaces of honesty within a culture that demanded silence. The very existence of these letters proves that affection could not be erased entirely, no matter how hard families tried to control it. Yet the risk attached to them also shows how fragile affection was under such a system. And while some lovers poured their hearts into paper under candlelight, others turned to silent signals hidden in fans, gloves, or pins, hoping to communicate without a single word being read. After the fragile words of letters passed through too many hands, couples often searched for other ways to speak without speaking. This was where the silent language of objects emerged, a code written in fans, gloves, and hairpins. In the strict formality of Victorian society, every gesture could carry meaning, and young people took advantage of this. They created small signals that looked harmless to outsiders, but whispered messages to those who knew how to read them. A fan lifted to the face, a glove dropped at the right moment, or a pin placed deliberately to one side of the hair, all became tools of quiet communication. These were the secret phrases of a world that forbade open honesty. The fan was perhaps the most powerful symbol. Women carried them constantly, especially at balls and social gatherings. A fan moved in one way might signal boredom, in another way curiosity, and in yet another a hint of affection. Touching it to the forehead could mean nervous excitement, a message to the man watching that she liked him but felt shy. Closing it sharply might signal annoyance. Families saw only a woman cooling herself, but those paying attention read the signs. This system of meaning gave young women a rare chance to express what they were not allowed to say aloud. It is almost humorous to realize that something as simple as holding a fan became riskier than speaking plainly, because the wrong movement could start rumors as quickly as any overheard word. Gloves also carried meaning. They were essential parts of dress, symbols of refinement and modesty. But a glove could be used as a message. Dropping one near a suitor might be a request for him to come closer, an invitation that no chaperone could accuse of impropriety. To pick up the glove and return it was to acknowledge the signal. To ignore it was to let the moment pass. For people living under such restrictions, this small act became a spark of connection. What looked like a clumsy accident was in fact deliberate, a carefully chosen gesture that might be remembered long after the evening ended. Hairpins and accessories added to this secret language. A woman might fix her pins slightly off to one side, not because it was practical, but because it sent a message. To those who understood, it hinted at the wish for private conversation, or at least a moment of closer attention. These signals were small enough to be dismissed if questioned, yet meaningful enough to guide behaviour. Couples built entire exchanges out of such gestures, weaving conversations of interest through objects rather than words. Modern readers may see this as excessive, even absurd, compared to today, when people can speak freely, message instantly, and express themselves openly. The Victorian reliance on silent gestures shows how tightly their world was bound by fear of impropriety. The very need to invent a hidden code proves how much emotion was forced underground. Affection was not absent, but it had to survive in disguise. This secret code did not always protect young people. Misinterpretation was common. A man might believe a signal meant interest when it was nothing more than chance. A woman might use the gesture carelessly, not realizing how others might interpret it. Families sometimes suspected these codes, and watchful mothers paid close attention to accessories and movements. Servants, too, noticed and reported what they saw. Even the secret language was never truly safe. Yet despite the risks, it spread widely. Manuals of etiquette even listed potential meanings of fan movements or glove gestures, half condemning and half acknowledging their use. This made the code both public and private. Everyone knew about it, yet it continued because couples needed it. Without such signals, they would have been left only with stifled conversation and censored letters. With them, they at least had the hope of creating a connection in a controlled world. For women, this language was empowering in its limited way. It gave them a method to express desire, caution, or curiosity within boundaries that silenced them otherwise. For men, it offered hints of encouragement or warning without words. The shared understanding of these signals built intimacy precisely because it was forbidden. To read a glance or a gesture correctly created a bond that felt secret, even if it was surrounded by watchful eyes. Still, the system reinforced how little freedom truly existed. Every signal had to be hidden within respectability. Every message risked discovery. Couples lived in a world where honesty was dangerous, so they built their honesty out of objects. But objects could betray them as easily as words. A fan dropped too often, a glove misplaced too boldly, or a pin adjusted too obviously could expose their intentions and spark gossip. I find it striking that people invested so much meaning into such tiny details, because it shows both their creativity and their lack of freedom. In an environment where everything was supervised, they carved out these small cracks where emotion could slip through. Yet the cracks were narrow, and the risk of being caught was always near. The codes also reveal the deep tension between desire and restraint. People wanted to show affection, but they could not. They wanted to be honest, but honesty could ruin them. So they lived in a half-world where gestures carried the weight of feelings too dangerous to name. To dance was to declare, to write was to risk, and to move a fan was to whisper in silence. This was Victorian romance, built not on freedom but on signals hidden in plain sight. And as these signals flickered in crowded rooms and silent parlours, the larger truth remained that love itself often never had the chance to grow, cut off before it could begin by the walls of class and family authority. Love in the Victorian world was fragile even before it had a chance to take root. The rules of family, class, and reputation weighed so heavily that many affections were ended almost as soon as they began. If a relationship crossed the boundaries of social class or ignored the expectations of family, it rarely survived. Families treated love not as a private feeling, but as a public danger when it threatened the carefully built structure of respectability. What began as a glance, a letter, or a whispered signal could be discovered and extinguished before it grew into anything lasting. In this society, the force that destroyed young romances was not a lack of feeling, but too much control from the outside. The most common obstacle was class. A young woman of higher standing who showed interest in someone beneath her rank faced swift consequences. Families feared that marrying below their station would damage their reputation, dilute their status, and invite whispers from society. The punishment often came quickly. Daughters were sent away under the excuse of rest or recuperation. These retreats, sometimes to country houses or the homes of distant relatives, were meant to separate her from the man she cared for. The message was clear. Love that crossed social lines had no place in a respectable household. It is almost bitterly humorous that what was called a restful holiday was, in reality, exile disguised as medicine. For young men, the outcome was often different but no less restrictive. A man who pursued a woman considered beneath his station risked being forced into an engagement with someone else. Families acted to redirect his attention toward women judged as worthy partners. This was not simply about personal preference. It was about securing alliances between households, preserving wealth, and maintaining influence. The heart of the young man mattered little compared to these priorities. He could be pressured, persuaded, or even threatened until he accepted a match that satisfied his family. These separations happened quietly, but their impact was severe. Young people learned that affection was powerless against the machinery of social expectation. A girl who cried over a forbidden romance might be told she was being dramatic. A boy who resisted might be lectured about duty. Neither had space to argue. Their futures were not theirs to decide. Families made sure of that. The methods of control varied. Sometimes it was direct removal, sending a daughter away to distant relatives. Other times, it was constant surveillance, ensuring that meetings never occurred again. Letters could be intercepted. Friends who tried to help could be warned or punished. Gossip spread quickly, and families feared scandal more than their children's unhappiness. A young woman labelled reckless for her feelings could find her prospects ruined. A young man branded disobedient might face damage to his career or inheritance. Modern readers might expect rebellion, but the cost was often too high. Compared to today, where couples might resist family disapproval and marry for love, Victorian couples lived in a system where disobedience meant losing social standing, financial support, and sometimes the possibility of marriage altogether. Love was not only discouraged, it was actively punished when it threatened the order. This constant suppression shaped how young people thought about relationships. Many accepted early that love was unreliable, that it could not be trusted as a guide for life. They learned instead to value duty and arrangement. Passion was left for novels and poems, while reality demanded caution. Those who dared to hope for more often discovered the limits of their society the moment they reached beyond their assigned circle. Some examples from the period show how strict these boundaries were. When a young woman of wealth fell in love with a tutor or a clerk, her family might remove her from the household entirely. The tutor could be dismissed, his reputation ruined. The girl might be sent to relatives in the countryside, expected to forget. In some cases, her letters were destroyed and her belongings searched for signs of attachment. Families treated her feelings as though they were an illness to be cured. The young man, meanwhile, might be pressured into leaving town or taking employment elsewhere. What looked like a private romance became a public problem. For those who experienced such losses, the memory often lingered. Some young women never married afterward, their reputations stained by the hint of scandal. Others were forced into marriages they did not want, living lives shaped by obedience rather than affection. Young men, too, carried the marks of broken romances. They might fulfill family duty, but they rarely forget the relationships cut short. In letters and diaries, traces of these suppressed loves survive, showing both the strength of feeling and the cruelty of its denial. The larger consequence was a culture where love itself was distrusted. Families taught their children that passion led to danger. They insisted that real security came from arrangement, not emotion. This lesson echoed in drawing rooms, in conversations over tea, and in the way people whispered about those who had broken the rules. To feel too much was to risk too much. The safe path was to submit. For some, these lessons created resignation. They married who they were told, lived as expected, and buried their personal desires. For others, the suppression created quiet rebellion, though rarely in ways strong enough to overturn family power. Some couples managed to meet in secret, clinging to their affections despite the risk. But such stories were rare, and their endings often tragic. Families usually won because society supported their authority. I think the saddest part is how many young people never even had the chance to test their feelings, because those feelings were cut off before they could grow. Love became something imagined rather than lived, an idea talked about more in fiction than in life. The system left little room for choice, and so romance withered under the weight of duty. This cycle repeated across households. Parents acted with the belief that they were protecting stability, while children learned that their hearts were not their own. Society reinforced this pattern with gossip, judgment, and exclusion. The result was a culture where love was rarely free, and where most people expected their futures to be arranged rather than chosen. And while families crushed these early sparks of romance, another measure of control waited, turning purity itself into a currency for marriage and binding women to standards they could never escape. Among all the unspoken rules that governed Victorian courtship, none was more heavily enforced than the demand for a woman's virginity before marriage. This expectation was not only a matter of morality, but also a form of social currency. In a culture that prized appearances above truth, a young woman's worth in the marriage market was measured in large part by whether she could present herself as untouched. Losing virginity before the wedding meant more than personal shame. It could erase her from the possibilities of upper society, closing doors to respectable households and leaving her future damaged beyond repair. The strictness of this rule explains why families invested so much effort into supervision. Every parlour meeting, every ball, and every walk in the garden was guarded to ensure that young women remained above suspicion. Reputation had to be protected at all costs. Even rumours of impropriety could be enough to harm a girl's prospects. Families feared not just scandal, but the loss of the family's standing in society. Marriage was not a private matter. It was a transaction between households, and purity was part of the price. It is almost sarcastic to say that young women were treated like investments, because that was exactly how many families thought of them. To enforce these standards, families sometimes took extraordinary measures. Investigations could be carried out quietly, with friends, servants, or acquaintances asked to report on a girl's behaviour. Mothers and fathers listened closely to gossip, weighing whether their daughter's reputation had suffered even the slightest blemish. In some cases, families even hired discreet individuals to verify what they called indirect proof of a woman's virtue. This did not mean medical examination in the sense we know today, but rather observation of behaviour, questioning of servants, or review of social interactions. The process was humiliating in its implication, reducing a young woman's life to a constant test she could never escape. The pressure created fear. Young women lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one misinterpreted gesture, could brand them forever. Even those who were innocent might suffer from whispers. A smile held too long, a letter discovered in a drawer, or the simple misfortune of being alone with a man for too many minutes could be enough to spark rumours. Once the rumours began, they were difficult to erase. Society preferred to assume guilt rather than innocence, and families were often left scrambling to repair the damage. When damage could not be erased, marriages were sometimes rushed. A wedding arranged quickly after a scandal was seen as a way to cover what had happened. If a young woman was suspected of having lost her virtue, families sought to tie her to the man involved before the whispers spread too far. These marriages were less about love than about crisis management. Compared to today, Where a relationship might survive a mistake or a misunderstanding, Victorian society responded to the same situation with near panic, forcing marriages not out of choice but out of fear. The consequences of failing to repair such a scandal were severe. A woman who lost her virginity outside marriage and did not marry quickly afterward was often excluded from polite society. Invitations disappeared, friends distanced themselves, and families withdrew their support. Her future became one of quiet isolation or, at best, marriage into a much lower circle. Her own household might treat her as a burden rather than a daughter. In the harshest cases, women were sent away, hidden from view so that the family name could survive without her. This double standard was striking. Men were rarely judged by the same measure. A man's reputation could survive impropriety, sometimes even gaining from whispers of experience. For women, the same whispers destroyed. The imbalance left them trapped, forced to guard themselves constantly while watching men escape consequence. Yet this unfairness was accepted as normal. Society built its order on it, and families enforced it without hesitation. The pressure to maintain purity shaped how women lived. They were taught from childhood to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. They were told to be modest in dress, careful in speech, and restrained in manner. Affection had to be hidden, curiosity suppressed, and feelings buried. Virginity was not simply physical. It was treated as a state of being, visible in posture and demeanour. Families expected their daughters to embody purity not only in fact but in performance. This performance was exhausting. Young women grew up knowing that their value was conditional, that it depended on something they could lose through no fault of their own. An assault, a rumour, or even a false accusation could erase years of careful behaviour.